I am 74 years old. My name is Robert Finch. I almost didn't go that night. My wife had tickets to something else entirely and I switched them out last minute because a friend called and told me he had 2 seats to The Tonight Show and I figured it would make for a good Friday. I was sitting in the 5th row when Joe Frazier said what he said. I was in the corridor outside the studio 20 minutes later when it happened. I've never told anyone the full version of what I saw that night. I'm telling it now because some stories deserve to be said while the people who were there can still say them. It was the spring of 1973 and The Tonight Show was the center of American entertainment in a way that's hard to describe to someone who didn't live through it. 5 nights a week, Johnny Carson and the whole country watching. There was nothing else like it. When you got tickets, you went. When you sat down in that studio, you understood you were inside something that mattered. My friend Dave had gotten the tickets through someone at his office. He didn't know the full guest list when he called me. Neither of us did. We found out when we sat down and the program listed 2 names under tonight's guests, Joe Frazier and Bruce Lee. Dave looked at me and said, "Well, that should be something." He had no idea. Joe Frazier in 1973 was one of the most famous athletes on earth. He had been heavyweight champion of the world. He had beaten Muhammad Ali. He had lost to George Foreman in January, the fight where Foreman knocked him down 6 times in 2 rounds and changed everything. But Joe Frazier with a loss was still Joe Frazier. Still one of the most physically formidable human beings who had ever put on a pair of gloves. Still the man with the left hook that coaches described the way astronomers describe black holes with a kind of reverent disbelief that something that powerful could actually exist in the real world. He carried himself accordingly, not arrogantly, not in the way of someone performing confidence, in the way of someone who had spent his whole life backing up everything he said with his body, had done it at the highest level against the best people alive, and didn't need to explain himself to anyone. He walked into rooms the way rooms needed to be walked into if Joe Frazier was in them. Bruce Lee, in 1973, was the other thing happening in American popular culture at that exact moment. Enter the Dragon had not come out yet, but everything around it had. The anticipation, the name, the footage, the reputation that had been building for a decade in martial arts circles and was now finally through a combination of the right film and the right moment reaching everyone else. He was known. He was becoming more known by the week. And unlike most people who became famous through entertainment, the people who actually trained, who actually spent time in gyms and dojos, and understood what real combat skill looked like spoke about Bruce Lee differently from how they spoke about other action stars. They spoke about him the way Joe Frazier spoke about certain other boxers with the specific respect that practitioners give each other. These 2 men were going to be on the same couch. Dave looked at the program and said, "Well, that should be something." I agreed with him. I still didn't know what something was going to turn out to mean. The show started at 8:30. Johnny's monologue good that night, the room already warm and ready. Then he introduced Joe first. Joe came out and the audience gave him the standing ovation that the heavyweight champion of the world received in 1973, which is to say the entire room was on its feet before he'd fully cleared the curtain. He settled into the guest chair with the ease of a man who had been in front of crowds his whole career and was comfortable being looked at by large groups of people. He and Johnny talked for a few minutes, the warm-up conversation of a talk show, recent fights, upcoming plans, what he'd been doing since January. Joe was engaging in the way that fighters sometimes unexpectedly are, with a directness and a lack of pretension that made him easy to listen to. Then Johnny said Bruce's name. The curtain opened and Bruce walked out. And the room responded the way rooms responded to Bruce Lee in 1973, which was with the specific noise of people encountering something they had seen on a screen and were now seeing in person. And finding that the in-person version matched what the screen had told them to expect, he shook Johnny's hand. He sat down in the chair next to Joe. They looked at each other. Joe nodded. Bruce nodded. The nod of 2 men who have each heard things about the other and are now doing the first real assessment in person. Johnny looked at both of them and did what he always did, which was find the most direct path to whatever was going to be most interesting. He said, I want to talk about something that I think the audience has been curious about ever since I put both your names on the same program tonight. We have boxing on one side and martial arts on the other. We have two completely different traditions, two completely different ways of thinking about physical combat. I want to know what each of you thinks about what the other does. Joe went first, which was natural because Joe had been there longer and because Joe didn't generally wait. He said, I respect the martial arts. I do. You look at what it takes to get to the level Bruce is at and you have to respect that. The discipline, the training, the dedication, that's real. That's legitimate. Johnny said, but. Joe looked at him said, I didn't say but. Johnny smiled. I heard one coming. Joe leaned back slightly. He said, what I'll say is that there's a difference between training and fighting. And there's a difference between fighting in a controlled context with rules, with a referee, with a specific set of things you're allowed to do and fighting in a professional boxing ring against someone who has spent their whole life learning to hit people as hard as humanly possible. Bruce said, that's a real distinction. Joe looked at him said, you agree? Bruce said, I agree that there's a difference between what you do and what I do. Whether the difference means what you think it means is a longer conversation. Joe studied him for a moment. Then he said, all right, I can have a longer conversation. For the next few minutes, the conversation stayed measured. Genuinely interesting, the two of them finding real points of comparison and real points of divergence in what they each did. Bruce talked about the principle of using an opponent's force, about timing and positioning, and why raw power was only one variable. Joe talked about what it felt like to hit someone who was actually trying to survive the hit, about the specific pressure of a professional fight where every variable was real and none of them were controlled. The audience was engaged. Dave leaned over to me at one point and said, this is actually good. It was. Then it stopped being good and started being something else entirely. Johnny was in the middle of a question about how each of them prepared differently for competition when Joe held up a hand. He said, Johnny, can I say something? Johnny said, of course. Joe said, I want to be straight with you about something because I think we're dancing around it and I don't really do dancing. Johnny said, all right. Joe looked at Bruce. He said, with respect. And I mean that. I'm saying it with actual respect. What are we doing here? You're a movie star. You're a very talented movie star who does incredible things in films and who clearly has real training behind it. I'm not dismissing that. But I am a professional fighter and those are two different things. And I don't want to sit here and have a conversation that implies they're the same thing because I don't think it serves either of us to pretend they are. The room was quiet, not hostile. The specific quiet of 400 people who have just registered that the conversation has changed character. Johnny said carefully. I think what Bruce has been saying is that the training is real, even if the application has been, Joe said. Johnny, one hook, one clean left hook. That's all I'm saying. One hook ends this conversation. One hook ends any conversation about whether what happens in a film and what happens in a ring are the same thing. I'm not saying this to be disrespectful. I'm saying it because it's true. And I think we all know it's true. Not a cheer, not a gasp. The complicated noise of 400 people processing something that was said directly enough to be impossible to pretend you didn't hear. Dave grabbed my arm. Johnny looked at Bruce. Bruce's face did something in the moment after Joe said it that I was close enough in row 5 to see clearly. Not anger, not hurt, something more specific than either of those. The expression of a man who has just been told something incorrect about himself in front of 400 people and is very calmly deciding how to respond to that. The said, before I was an actor, I was a martial artist. I have trained students who went on to become champions in multiple disciplines. I have spent more time doing real contact training than most professional fighters spend in their entire careers. The films came after all of that, not instead of it. Joe said, I hear you, but there's a difference between training and having someone on the other side of you who is specifically and professionally trying to knock you out. That pressure changes everything. Bruce said, I agree that pressure changes things. I disagree that the pressure I've trained under is less real than you're assuming. Joe said, I've been in a ring with guys who could hit. I've been hit hard. I've had people try to take my head off. What does your training look like against that? If you think that exchange was where things got serious, what Joe said about 90 seconds later makes that look like polite disagreement. Bruce said, it looks like not being where the hit is aimed. Joe looked at him. Johnny said, that's a philosophy. Joe said, Johnny, come on. He wasn't hostile about it. He said it the way you say it to a friend who is trying to manage a situation that doesn't need managing. He said, let's be real about this. Let's just be real. I'm one of the best fighters who ever lived. I'm sitting next to a man who learned to fight for cameras and we're talking about it like it's a coin flip. It's not a coin flip. The audience made a sound. Bruce said, no one said it was a coin flip. Joe said, then what are you saying? Bruce said, I'm saying you don't have enough information to make the assessment you just made. Joe said, what information am I missing? Bruce said, what I actually am. Joe looked at him for a moment. Then he said something that froze the room. He said, all right, show me. Johnny said, now, Joe said. I'm serious, Johnny. We keep talking about it. Let's stop talking about it. Johnny stood up halfway. He said with the tone of a man who has been doing live television for 11 years and knows exactly what this moment requires. I'm going to stop you both right there. We are on live television and this is going to stay a conversation. A great conversation, one of the best we've had, but a conversation. Joe said, why? Johnny said, because I have a license and a studio audience and a network that I'd like to continue working for. The audience laughed. Some of the tension broke, not all of it. Johnny said, let's take a break. Come back. Continue this. Keep it verbal. The on-air light dropped. And here is where the evening changed into something different from a television segment. During the commercial break, instead of the tension releasing, it built. I could see the couch from row 5 and what I could see was Joe leaning toward Bruce, still talking, not letting the break interrupt what he was saying, and Bruce sitting completely still and listening with the expression of someone who has made a decision and is waiting for the right moment to execute it. Fred Dordova was on the floor immediately, the way he always was when something needed managing. He spoke to both of them, quiet, urgent, the practiced tone of someone whose job requires this exact kind of conversation on a regular basis. I watched his face, not theirs, because Fred's face was the instrument that told you how bad the situation actually was. And what his face said was, this is not going well. Bruce said something to Fred that I was too far away to hear. Fred looked at him for a moment, then looked at Joe, then went back toward the production area with the body language of a man who has tried the available tools and found them insufficient. Dave said under the noise of the break, do you think they're actually going to fight? I said, I didn't know. The on-air light came back on. Johnny settled behind his desk. He said, we are back. And I want to say that during the break, we had a very productive conversation about keeping this segment productive. So, let's, Joe said, Bruce. Johnny stopped. Joe was not looking at Johnny. He was looking at Bruce. He said with a quiet that was somehow louder than anything he'd said before. I want to ask you something directly. Not for the cameras, not for the audience. Directly. Bruce said, ask it. Joe said, do you actually believe that what you've trained prepares you for what I do? Bruce said, yes. Joe said, then prove it. The audience erupted. Not in a neat way. Not the organized noise of an audience responding to a planned moment. The disorganized noise of 400 people reacting to something they weren't prepared for. Chairs shifting, voices overlapping, the specific kinetic energy of a room that is suddenly understood that the two people on the stage in front of it are not performing. Johnny was on his feet behind his desk, but fully standing, not the halfway rise he'd done before. He said, "Gentlemen, I am going to ask you both as your host on my show, to remain seated." Neither of them remained seated. Joe stood up, not aggressively, not with his hands raised, just stood up the way a man stands up when a conversation has run its natural course, and the next thing is not conversation. He was 6 feet tall and 205 pounds. And when Joe Frazier stood up in a room, the room knew it. Bruce stood up. He was 5 feet 7 inches and 140 pounds. And when Bruce Lee stood up in a room, you understood, if you were the kind of person who understood these things, that the numbers were not what mattered. Johnny said, "Security." Dave grabbed my arm again. 3 or 4 crew members were already moving from the edges of the studio toward the center of the stage. 2 security people who had been positioned near the side entrance were in motion. Fred Dordova was back on the floor moving fast, saying something to both of them that was clearly not reaching either of them. Bruce said something to Joe that I couldn't hear from row 5. Joe responded. Then Bruce walked past the desk toward the side of the stage and Joe followed him, and the 2 of them and the 5 or 6 people trying to stop them disappeared through the side entrance into the corridor behind the stage. I looked at Dave, he looked at me. We were both on our feet along with most of the people in the studio audience. And for about 10 seconds, nobody did anything except try to see what was happening through the entrance where they'd gone. Then I made a decision that I have never fully been able to explain. I went to the entrance, the corridor behind the Tonight Show stage at NBC Burbank, connected to a larger backstage area that I had passed through on the way to the bathroom earlier that evening. I had enough sense of the layout to move toward where I thought they would be, and enough sense of the situation to move fast. I made it into the backstage corridor about 30 seconds after they did. A small crowd had followed, crew members and 1 or 2 other audience members who had done the same thing I had. The corridor was narrow and the sound bounced off concrete walls. And what I could hear as I moved through it was voices, more than 2. Several people talking at once. The specific sound of a group of people all trying to stop something while the thing they're trying to stop is not listening. I came around the corner into the equipment staging area and I could see them. The staging area was big enough. Rubber floor, high ceiling, industrial lighting. Joe had his jacket off. Bruce still had his jacket on. The crew members and security who had followed them were positioned around the edges of the space, and it was clear from the configuration that they had tried to get between the 2 of them and had not succeeded and were now in the specific position of people waiting to see what happened rather than people able to stop it from happening. Joe said something. I was close enough now to hear it clearly. He said, "You want to do this? Let's do it. Let's find out what 4 seconds actually looks like." Bruce said, "All right." Joe came forward. He moved the way Joe Frazier moved, which was with the forward pressure that had defined his entire career. The specific advance of a man whose strategy was to close distance and make his presence impossible to manage. He feinted with his right, the setup for the hook, the same sequence he had run thousands of times against the best fighters alive. He was mid-motion when Bruce moved. I watched it and I am not able to describe it in a way that fully captures what it looked like in real time, which was something between a disappearance and a redirection. Bruce was no longer where the feint assumed he would be, had moved to an angle that put him outside the committed weight of Joe's approach. And as Joe's momentum carried him into the space where Bruce had been, something happened with Bruce's hand. A contact so brief and so precisely placed that I couldn't fully track it from where I was standing. Joe went to one knee. Not hard, not a knockdown in the boxing sense. Not from impact, more like the floor appeared under him earlier than he expected. His balance taken at the exact moment when his weight was committed and couldn't compensate. He was down for maybe 3 seconds. The staging area was completely silent. Joe pushed himself up slowly, not because he was hurt, but because something was happening in his processing of what had just occurred that was taking longer than usual. He stood. He looked at the space in front of him where Bruce was standing. He said low enough that I almost missed it. "How?" Bruce said, "You were already going." I just added a direction. Joe looked at him. He said, do it again. Several people said no. Simultaneously, the crew members around the edges of the room, one of the security people. It didn't matter. Joe came forward again. Same approach because Joe Frazier had one approach and it worked and he believed in it, but different this time, more cautious, trying to read what had happened the first time and account for it happened again, different angle, different moment, same result. Joe's knee hit the rubber floor and his hand came down to catch himself and he stayed there longer, this time 4 or 5 seconds looking at the ground between his hands. He got up, he looked at Bruce. Something was working in his face that I had not seen in any photograph or broadcast of Joe Frazier. An expression that was not quite disbelief and not quite recognition, but somewhere between them, the specific look of a man encountering information that doesn't fit anywhere in his existing model of how the world works. He said again, everyone in that room said no. Security people, crew members, 2 producers who had come in behind me. It was a chorus of no. Bruce looked at Joe. He said, you already have the answer. Joe said, I want to understand it. Bruce said, you won't get it from a third time. You'll get it from thinking about the first 2. Joe looked at him for a long moment. His breathing was elevated, less from physical effort than from something else. From the specific state of a man whose understanding of a situation is being revised in real time, and the revision is significant. Joe said, what did you do? Bruce said, you were committed before you were there. Every time your body was in the sequence before your feet arrived. I moved after the commitment and before the arrival. That window is very small, but it exists. Joe said, how do you find it that fast? Bruce said, I've been finding it for 20 years. Joe said nothing. He stood there in the middle of the equipment staging area at NBC Burbank with his jacket off and his knee dusty from the rubber floor and his jaw working slightly. The way a jaw works when a man is thinking something he hasn't finished thinking yet. Then he said, 1 hook. Bruce waited. Joe said, I said 1 hook ends your career. Bruce said, yes. Joe said, I was wrong about that. Bruce said nothing. He nodded. The small clean nod that I had seen him use earlier in the evening. The nod that means I understand and I accept this and we don't need more words about it. The crew members and security people had moved into the staging area properly now and were trying to establish some kind of order. 2 producers were talking to each other near the door. Someone said something about the show, about whether there were still minutes left in the segment, about whether they were coming back on. Fred Dordova came in. He looked at both of them. He said, are we done? Joe said, we're done. Fred said, are you both all right? Bruce said, yes. Joe said, I'm fine. He reached down and picked up his jacket from the floor where he dropped it. He put it back on. Then he looked at Bruce and said, I owe you an apology for what I said on the stage. Bruce said, you said what you believed. Joe said, I said what I believed before I had enough information. Bruce said, that's how it usually goes. Joe almost smiled. A small thing, brief, but real. Fred looked at both of them and said they were going back on for a final minute to wrap the segment. They both nodded. I made it back to my seat in row 5 about 30 seconds before the on-air light came back on. Dave looked at me when I sat down and said, where did you go? And I said, backstage. And he said, you went backstage. And I said, yes. And he said, and I said, I'll tell you after. Johnny came back from wherever he had been during the interval, which I later found out was a tense conversation in his office with Fred about whether the show was still going to end professionally. He sat behind his desk and looked at the camera with the expression of a man who has decided to be completely honest. He said, all right, I'm not going to pretend the last 10 minutes didn't happen. They happened. What I can tell you is that both of our guests are fine. The show is fine, and what occurred, while not what I planned for this segment, was genuine, real in this business that's rarer than you'd think. He looked at Joe, who had come back to the couch. Then at Bruce, who was in his chair, he said, Joe, you said something earlier that I want to give you a chance to respond to now. Joe said, I know what I said. He looked at the camera. He said, I said one hook ends his career. I want to tell the audience that I was wrong about that. I don't say that often, but I was wrong, and I'd rather say it here than not say it. The audience applauded. Johnny looked at Bruce. Bruce said, Joe Frazier is one of the most complete fighters who has ever existed. What he does is real. It's legitimate, and anyone who dismisses it doesn't understand what they're dismissing. What I'd add to that is that what I do is also real. Also legitimate and also not fully understood by most people who see it from the outside. Both of those things are true at the same time. Johnny said, is there anything else you want to add? Bruce said, no. Johnny looked at the camera. He said, ladies and gentlemen, tonight's show, Friday night, that's all I have to say about it. Dave and I walked out of that studio at close to midnight with most of the audience. The specific slow shuffle of people exiting a room that they're not quite ready to leave. On the sidewalk outside, people were talking to each other. Strangers talking to strangers. The thing that happens when a shared experience is big enough to override the normal rules about who you talk to in public. In the car driving home, Dave said, what did you see back there? I told him. I told him the whole thing. Both times Joe went down. The conversation after what Joe said about being wrong. Dave drove for a while without saying anything. Then he said, how fast? I said, 4 seconds the first time, maybe 3. Dave said, Joe Frazier. I said, Joe Frazier. We drove the rest of the way in quiet. I have thought about that evening many times in the 50 years since. Thought about the couch and the hook line and the way the room shifted when Joe said it. Thought about the corridor and the staging area and the specific quality of silence after the first time Joe hit the floor. What I come back to most is what happened after Joe saying he was wrong. Not performing the admission, not doing it for cameras or for credit, doing it in a staging area with a dozen crew members watching and his jacket in his hand and the dust from the rubber floor on his knee. That took something, whatever you want to call what it takes to do that. In that moment, Joe Frazier had it. And Bruce wading through the whole thing, through the hook line and the crowd noise and the chaos of everyone trying to stop what was happening with the complete stillness of someone who knew what the end of the evening looked like before it happened and was patient enough to let it get there on its own schedule. I was in row 5. I was in that corridor. I saw all of it. Some things you carry with you for 50 years because they were loud. Some because they were true. This one was both.